Hey, what's up? Welcome back to your channel name. This time, we're going to dive into a story that will make you think twice before walking alone at night. Grab some snacks, turn off the lights, and listen closely. In a remote village tucked between misty hills and ancient forests, lived a young man named Ethan Waverley. Life in his hometown had always been simple, surrounded by age-old traditions and tales whispered from one generation to another. Ethan, in his mid-20s, carried a quiet curiosity about the world beyond his borders. He had short, messy dark hair, thoughtful blue eyes, and an aura of quiet resilience. Raised by his grandmother after his parents' untimely passing, Ethan learned to find beauty in silence and stories in the wind. His days were spent helping with small tasks around the village, but his nights were consumed by a longing to uncover the mysteries buried within the woods. The villagers often warned about the spirits said to roam after sunset, but to Ethan, those were merely old fears stitched into the fabric of tradition. He believed there had to be more, a deeper truth hidden beyond superstition. Accompanying him through most of his life was his childhood friend, Lila Marin. Lila had a fire in her soul that contrasted Ethan's calm demeanor. Her bright green eyes and untamed curls made her impossible to ignore in any crowd. Unlike the rest of the villagers, Lila believed that the world was far stranger than anyone dared to admit. She often spoke of dreams that seemed to predict small events, like rain arriving early or an unexpected visitor at the village inn. Ethan found comfort in her presence, as if together they could withstand whatever the world might throw at them. Though their bond was strong, both of them carried secrets they had never dared to speak aloud, secrets that would soon be forced into the light. The first signs that something was amiss began with the forest itself. Trees that once stood tall and strong started to wither overnight. Birds, once abundant and lively, vanished without a trace. The villagers whispered about curses and ancient anger, but Ethan could not ignore the strange tug at his own heart, as if something unseen was calling to him. One evening, as he stood at the edge of the woods, he felt the air shift, heavier, colder. A peculiar humming, almost inaudible, seemed to vibrate beneath his feet. It wasn't fear that rooted him to the spot, but a strange sense of recognition, as if he had been here before in another life. Lila noticed his growing distraction. She watched him more closely, noting the way his gaze often drifted to the tree line, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. Something ancient was awakening, and whatever it was, Ethan appeared to be at its center. The village soon became a place of uneasy glances and hurried steps. Doors were bolted long before the sun dipped below the horizon. Livestock were found lifeless in the mornings, their eyes wide open in terror, bodies untouched by predators. Flowers placed on graves would wither within hours, leaving the cemetery bare and forlorn. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow connected to it all. Dreams haunted him every night, visions of shadowy figures standing at the edge of his bed, whispers too faint to understand but heavy with menace. Each morning, he woke drenched in sweat, the echoes of those whispers still clinging to him like a second skin. Lila, too, began experiencing the unexplainable. She found cryptic symbols carved into her door, ones no one in the village recognized. Objects in her home shifted positions when she wasn't looking. Cold drafts brushed against her skin even when all windows were closed. Though the villagers spoke little, Ethan and Lila knew that fear had gripped every heart. Something was creeping closer, and it was no longer content to stay hidden in the shadows. It was during one particularly restless night that Ethan discovered an old, forgotten trail at the farthest edge of the woods. The path was choked with overgrown vines and shrouded in mist so dense it swallowed sound. No one in the village had mentioned it, not even in the oldest tales. It felt wrong, ancient, as though it had been abandoned for a reason lost to time. Yet the pull he felt was undeniable. Against his better judgment, he returned to the trail night after night, each time venturing a little farther, each time feeling the oppressive atmosphere thicken around him. Lila tried to dissuade him, sensing the danger in ways she couldn't explain, but Ethan's resolve grew stronger with every visit. His connection to the path felt almost sacred, as if answers he had sought his entire life lay hidden at its end. He didn't notice the subtle changes in himself, his paler complexion, the sleepless look in his eyes, the way his shadow seemed a second too slow to follow him. The village watched in silent dread, for they had seen this before, long ago, and it had not ended well. Deep within the forest, where the mist turned thicker and the air colder, Ethan found a clearing unlike anything he had ever seen. In the center stood a massive stone altar, covered in moss and strange, shifting carvings that seemed to breathe when looked at too long. Surrounding it were dozens of small totems, each one different, yet each emanating a palpable aura of sorrow and despair. The ground was littered with bones, some animal, some disturbingly human. Ethan's heart pounded against his ribs, but his feet moved forward on their own, drawn by an invisible thread. As he approached the altar, he noticed something even more unsettling, a mirror, perfectly intact despite the ravages of time, standing upright among the ruins. When he peered into it, he did not see his reflection. Instead, he saw himself standing in a burning village, surrounded by shadows that reached out with clawed hands. His body froze, mind screaming for him to run, yet he could not tear his gaze away. In that moment, he understood that he was no longer merely a bystander. He had been chosen, bound by forces older and more merciless than he could ever have imagined. And it was only just beginning. After that night at the altar, Ethan could no longer separate dreams from reality. The village, once a place of muted colors and slow-moving days, became twisted in his eyes. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. Familiar faces blurred at the edges, smiling with mouths that seemed too wide, eyes that gleamed with something cruel. Wherever he went, the mirror image from the forest haunted him, visions of fire, destruction, and hands pulling him into darkness. The villagers began to avoid him openly now, murmuring prayers when he passed, clutching their talismans tighter. Even Lila, who had always stood by him, seemed torn between her loyalty and growing fear. She noticed that Ethan no longer cast a reflection in windows or puddles. Whispers followed him everywhere, and strange footprints appeared outside his home at night, large, clawed, and always facing inward, as if something was waiting for him to open the door. The forest itself seemed to inch closer to the village, branches creeping across fields, mist coiling around houses even in broad daylight. And in the dead of night, an eerie, melodic hum would echo from the woods, carrying with it a sorrow so deep that many villagers wept in their sleep without knowing why. It was during this descent into terror that an old scandal resurfaced. Ethan's grandmother, in a moment of delirious confession, revealed a buried truth. Ethan was the product of an affair between his mother and a stranger who had wandered into the village decades ago. This man, unknown to most, was not entirely human. Some said he came from the forest itself, a being of the old world that the villagers had once worshipped and later tried to forget. The realization struck Ethan like a blow. His blood carried the legacy of betrayal, his mother's infidelity had bound him to forces beyond human understanding. This truth explained his unnatural draw to the forest, the altar, and the mirror. It was not just curiosity, it was a calling, an inheritance soaked in ancient wrath. Lila, shaken by the revelation, feared that Ethan was no longer fully himself. The more the darkness seeped into him, the more he resembled the entity that once cursed the village. Whispers among the elders grew louder. Ethan was the harbinger of a reckoning that had been postponed too long. On a night when the mist was so thick it swallowed lantern light whole, Ethan found himself drawn back to the altar. This time, he did not arrive alone. Figures emerged from the woods, ghostly, half-formed shapes of those who had once lived and suffered in the village. They circled the altar, chanting in a language Ethan could not comprehend yet somehow understood. The mirror glowed, and a figure stepped out, a tall, shadowed being with eyes like burning coals. Ethan realized, with a horrifying clarity, that this was his true father, the spirit who had seduced his mother and cursed the bloodline. The entity offered him a bargain: embrace his heritage and reign over the broken village, or reject it and be torn apart, body and soul, by the very spirits that now surrounded him. Torn between the life he had known and the destiny written into his blood, Ethan hesitated. The air grew heavier, the chanting louder. He could feel the villagers' fear like a tangible thing pressing against his skin. His choice would determine not only his fate but the future of everyone he had ever known. Desperate to hold on to what little humanity he had left, Ethan tried to reject the bargain. He turned away from the mirror, from the altar, from the chanting dead. But the forest had already claimed him. His refusal only enraged the spirits. A scream ripped through the night, not from Ethan, but from the village itself. As he stumbled back toward the village, he saw fire blooming on the horizon. Houses burned, and the mist twisted into grotesque shapes that clawed at the fleeing villagers. Crops withered to ash within moments. The earth itself split open in some places, spewing thick black smoke. In the center of the chaos stood Lila, clutching a bundle wrapped tightly in cloth, an old relic from the church, a final hope to stave off the curse. Ethan saw her raise it toward him, her eyes filled with both hope and terror. But even as she tried to reach him, the ground between them crumbled into a bottomless abyss. Ethan realized with sickening certainty that the curse was no longer something he could deny. It had taken root not just in him, but in the very soul of the land. In a moment of blind desperation, Ethan ran back to the altar. He fell to his knees before the mirror, bloodied and broken, screaming for a way to undo what had been set into motion. The mirror's surface rippled, showing him visions of a life that could have been, a life where he and Lila lived peacefully, untouched by darkness. But as he reached out to grasp it, the mirror shattered into 1,000 black shards that rained down around him. The entity that was his father no longer offered choices. It merged with Ethan in a torrent of searing agony, binding their souls together forever. Ethan's body twisted, his skin marked with ancient sigils that glowed faintly in the dark. His mind splintered under the weight of his new existence. He was no longer merely human, nor fully spirit, he had become something else entirely. A living curse, a vessel for endless suffering. As dawn broke over the ruined village, a new figure stood at the edge of the forest. His eyes were familiar yet alien, his face both Ethan's and something far older. He turned away from the smoking remains of the village, disappearing into the mist, carrying the curse forward. The land itself would never heal, and wherever Ethan went, ruin would follow. And so began the long, endless journey of the cursed son of betrayal, hunted by those who survived, sought by those who would harness his power, and followed always by the ghosts of his own making. Long after the fires died and the mist receded, the village stood silent, nothing more than a graveyard of charred ruins and broken dreams. Those few who survived refused to speak of that night, pretending the village had never existed. Yet, whispers traveled beyond the hills, of a cursed wanderer cloaked in ash, of crops failing when his shadow touched the fields, of children waking from nightmares that bled into reality. Ethan had become a myth almost overnight, a dark legend that parents invoked to keep their children from wandering too far after sunset. Those who dared to speak his name said that he was still searching, forever trapped between two worlds, neither dead nor truly alive. And always, in the dead silence before dawn, the faint sound of chanting could be heard, echoes from the altar buried beneath the ruins, a reminder that the curse had not been broken, only reborn. Miles away, across a dense thicket of forest and fog, a new village had begun to rise. Bright, hopeful faces tilled the land and built homes where none had stood before. They knew nothing of the cursed soil beneath their feet or the black history that had seeped into the roots of the trees surrounding them. But the land remembered. It remembered the betrayal, the blood spilled, the oaths broken. And as the villagers celebrated their first harvest, strange things began to happen. Livestock were found mutilated without any sign of a predator. Children spoke in tongues they could not understand. Dreams became riddled with images of a man with burning eyes walking toward them, whispering promises of ruin. The curse had found fertile ground once more. It would not remain buried for long. Somewhere beyond the reach of this growing darkness, Lila survived. Scarred by the night of fire and loss, she had taken refuge in a distant monastery. Her body was frail, but her will remained unbroken. She spent her days poring over ancient texts, desperate to find a way to sever the bloodline curse that had consumed Ethan. She discovered a ritual, hidden in forbidden scriptures, that spoke of binding a soul to stone, trapping the curse forever if done before the second cycle of devastation completed itself. But the price would be unbearable. To save countless lives, she would have to sacrifice the one she had once loved beyond reason. The clock was already ticking. Signs of the curse's spread grew daily, and Ethan's monstrous form wandered ever closer to the new village, drawn by a hunger he no longer understood. As the second harvest approached, a heavy unease settled over the new village. Crops rotted on the vine, wells turned black overnight, and the villagers began to turn on one another, driven mad by invisible forces. In the distance, a figure could be seen standing at the edge of the forest, never moving, yet somehow closer each time someone looked away. Lila knew she had no time left. Armed with the ancient stone and a blade tempered in sacred rites, she journeyed toward the village, her heart breaking with every step. She prayed that Ethan's soul, buried deep beneath the monstrous curse, might recognize her and make the final sacrifice easier. But in her deepest fears, she knew the boy she had loved might already be gone forever, consumed by something far older and far crueler than either of them could comprehend. On the night of the blood moon, Lila found him at last. He stood among the twisted remains of the old trees, the mist curling around him like living hands. His eyes flickered with recognition, or perhaps mockery, as she approached. In that frozen moment, the memories of a life once promised flickered between them, laughter, promises, dreams now turned to ashes. Without hesitation, Lila drove the sacred blade deep into the earth at his feet, unleashing the binding ritual. The ground trembled violently, and a scream tore through the air, so raw and deep it seemed to split the heavens themselves. Ethan's form convulsed, torn between the monstrous spirit and the remnants of the boy he once was. For a heartbeat, Lila saw the real Ethan again, eyes wide with sorrow and a silent apology. Then, in a blinding flash of light, he was gone, sealed within the stone, the curse chained once more but not destroyed. As Lila collapsed, spent and broken, the villagers cautiously emerged from their homes, sensing a shift in the air. They would rebuild again, as humans always did, forgetting the past until the past demanded to be remembered once more. Far away, buried deep beneath root and rock, the stone pulsed faintly in the darkness, waiting. Because some curses do not die, they only sleep. That was our story for tonight. Do you think it's just an ordinary tale, or is there something more to it? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. See you, if you still dare to watch next time.